Sometimes the most broken things choose us when we need them most. In 1972, 6-year-old Eva had just lost her parents when she walked into a small-town animal shelter and saw a dog nobody else wanted. He was starving and covered in mud, but something in his eyes called to her wounded heart. Her grandfather said broken things don't always heal, but Eva brought him home anyway. She named him Lucky, and for 50 years he stayed by her side through every joy and heartbreak. He seemed to age slowly, always watching over her like a guardian angel with 4 paws. Now Eva is 58, and she's back in her childhood home after her grandfather's passing. As she goes through old memories, she discovers something impossible about Lucky that will change everything she thought she knew. What happens when Eva uncovers the truth about her faithful companion? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1972 painted Millbrook, Ohio, in shades of amber and rust, the kind of small town where everyone knew your business before you did. 6-year-old Eva Marie Patterson sat in the passenger seat of her grandfather's weathered Ford pickup, her small hands folded in her lap, wearing a denim jacket that had belonged to her mother, sleeves rolled up 3 times and still too long. The jacket still held the faint scent of lavender perfume, a ghost of comfort in a world that had suddenly become too large and too quiet. Henry Patterson gripped the steering wheel with calloused hands that had built barns and mended fences for 43 years. At 67, he was a man of few words, but his silence since the accident 2 months ago had deepened into something that felt like a well with no bottom. He cleared his throat, a sound that had become his way of announcing difficult conversations. "Eva, honey, we don't have to do this today if you're not ready." She turned to look at him with eyes the color of summer sky, eyes that had seen too much for such a young face. "I want to, Grandpa. You said dogs need love, and I have love." The simplicity of her words hit him square in the chest. Since Sarah and Jim's accident, he couldn't bring himself to say death around Eva. The child had barely spoken. The psychologist in Akron had used big words about trauma and processing, but Henry understood it simply. His granddaughter was drowning in a silence that felt safer than facing a world without her parents. The Millbrook Animal Shelter sat at the edge of town, a modest brick building that had once been a veterinary clinic. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, a woman whose grey hair was always perfectly curled and whose floral dresses never wrinkled, had run the place for 15 years with the kind of no-nonsense compassion that small towns produced. "Henry Patterson," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel as they entered. "And this must be Eva. I was so sorry to hear about Sarah and Jim. Fine people, both of them." Henry nodded, the muscle in his jaw tightening. Eva stepped closer to his side, instinctively seeking the shelter of his presence. "We're looking for a dog," Henry said. "Something gentle, good with children." Mrs. Kellerman's eyes softened as she looked at Eva. "Well, let's see what we can do. We've got several lovely animals right now. Follow me." The kennels stretched down a narrow hallway, each one holding a story of abandonment or circumstance. Dogs of various sizes and ages pressed against the chain-link gates, tails wagging with desperate hope. Eva walked slowly beside her grandfather, studying each animal with the kind of careful attention that comes from understanding what it means to be left behind. A golden retriever mix caught Mrs. Kellerman's attention. "Now, this here's Honey. She's 3 years old, good with kids, house-trained," but Eva had stopped walking. At the very end of the hallway, in the last kennel, something had caught her eye. Henry followed her gaze and felt his heart sink. The dog was a mess. Clearly a shepherd mix of some kind, but so thin that his ribs showed through matted fur the color of mud and neglect. His coat was patched with what looked like old burns or mange, and one ear was torn. But it was his eyes that stopped Henry. Cold, ancient eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than any animal should possess, and a sadness that mirrored the one he'd been seeing in Eva's face for 2 months. "Oh, honey," Mrs. Kellerman said quickly, "you don't want that one. Well, we call him number 7. Been here since spring. He was found half dead on the interstate, probably hit by a car. Dr. Morrison did what he could, but—" She lowered her voice. "Between you and me, Henry, we're probably looking at putting him down next week. He won't let anyone get close, won't eat properly. He's just given up." Eva had walked to the kennel and was now sitting cross-legged in front of the gate. The dog, number 7, had not moved from where he lay in the far corner, but his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made Henry uncomfortable. "Eva," he said gently, "maybe we should look at some of the other dogs." She didn't respond. Instead, she began to speak to the animal in a voice so soft Henry had to strain to hear. "I know you're scared," she whispered. "I'm scared too. My mommy and daddy went to heaven in their car, and now it's just me and Grandpa, and everything feels different. But maybe we could be scared together." The dog's ears twitched. The first movement anyone had seen from him in days. Eva reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of the peanut butter sandwich Henry had packed for her lunch. She tore off a small piece and slipped it through the chain link. "My mommy always said peanut butter makes everything better. She made me sandwiches with the crusts cut off because I didn't like them. But now I eat the crusts because they remind me of her." Number 7 lifted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the offered food. Mrs. Kellerman shook her head. "Eva, sweetie, he won't take food from people. We've tried everything." But as they watched, the dog slowly it seemed like he was moving through deep water, rose to his feet and took a tentative step toward the gate. Then another. His movements were painful to watch, each step clearly an effort, but there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there moments before. He reached the gate and gently took the piece of sandwich from Ava's fingers, his teeth barely grazing her skin. Their eyes met through the chain link, and Henry could have sworn he felt something shift in the air around them, like the moment just before a storm breaks. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Kellerman breathed. Eva looked up at her. Grandfather with those blue eyes that held too much understanding for a 6-year-old. "This is him, Grandpa. This is my dog." Henry knelt beside her, studying the animal that had somehow responded to his granddaughter when it had given up on everyone else. The dog was looking at Eva with something that went beyond typical animal. Affection. There was recognition there, as if he'd been waiting specifically for her. "Eva, he's hurt pretty bad. Taking care of him would be a big responsibility, and there's no guarantee—" "Grandpa," she interrupted, her small hand finding his weathered one. "He chose me, just like you chose me when Mommy and Daddy couldn't. Stay, sometimes broken things need each other." The words hit Henry with unexpected force. In 2 months of trying to find the right thing to say to help his granddaughter heal, she had just summed up everything he'd been feeling in one simple sentence. Mrs. Kellerman was already shaking her head. "Henry, I appreciate what the child is trying to do, but this dog has significant medical needs. The vet bills alone—" "How much?" Henry asked quietly. "Well, he'd need shots, a full examination, treatment for the mange, probably medication for pain. We're talking several $100, and that's just to start. And honestly, at his age and condition, he might not make it through the winter." Shiva's fingers were now pressed against the chain link, and the dog had moved closer, allowing her to touch his nose through the fence. The simple contact seemed to give him strength. His tail gave the slightest wag. "What's his story?" Henry asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. State trooper found him on I-77, said it looked like he'd been wandering for weeks. No collar, no tags. Half-starved, dehydrated. Those burns on his coat suggest he'd been in some kind of fire. Could be a farm dog whose family lost their place. Could be he belonged to someone who couldn't care for him anymore. These days, people dump animals like they're throwing out trash. The bitterness in her voice was matched by the sadness in the dog's eyes, and Henry made his decision. "We'll take him." Mrs. Kellerman blinked. "Henry, did you hear what I just said about the medical?" "I heard you. We'll take him." He looked at Eva, who was now humming softly to the dog, the same lullaby Sarah used to sing when Eva couldn't sleep. "Some things are worth the risk." The paperwork took an hour. Henry wrote a check for the adoption fee, scheduled an appointment with Dr. Morrison, and listened to Mrs. Kellerman's list of instructions and warnings. Eva never left the dog's side, and by the time they were ready to go, the animal was sitting, pressed against the gate, watching her every movement. Loading him into the truck required patience and gentleness. The dog was clearly in pain, but he allowed Henry to lift him into the passenger seat, where he immediately settled next to Eva, as if he'd been riding in that truck his entire life. "What are we going to call him?" Henry asked as they pulled out of the shelter parking lot. Eva considered this seriously, one small hand resting on the dog's head. He'd closed his eyes at her touch, and for the first time since they'd found him, his body seemed to relax completely. "Lucky," she said finally, "because he got lucky when we found him, and we got lucky when we found him." Henry glanced in the rearview mirror at Mrs. Kellerman, who was standing in the doorway shaking her head. He had a feeling this decision was either going to be the best thing he'd ever done, or it was going to break both their hearts. But as he watched Eva gently stroke Lucky's matted fur, whispering promises about warm beds and good food, and never being alone again, Henry realized something had changed in his granddaughter. For the first time since the accident, she looked like she had a purpose beyond just surviving each day. Lucky opened one eye and looked directly at Henry in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, Henry could have sworn the dog nodded as if to say, "Don't worry, old man, I've got this." The drive home was quiet except for Eva's soft humming and the occasional whimper from Lucky as they hit bumps in the road. But it was a different kind of quiet than the hollow silence that had filled Henry's house for 2 months. This quiet held possibility. As they pulled into the gravel driveway of the small white farmhouse that had been in the Patterson family for 3 generations, Henry looked at the pair beside him, a broken little girl and a broken dog who had somehow found each other and felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible phone call from the state police. He felt hope. 52 years later, Eva Patterson Morrison pulled into that same gravel driveway, her hands trembling as she turned off the engine of her silver Honda. The October air carried the same crisp promise it always had, but everything else felt impossibly different. The white farmhouse looked smaller somehow, like memory had enlarged it beyond its actual proportions, but it stood solid and welcoming under the afternoon sun. She sat in the car for several minutes, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. At 58, Eva had learned that some homecomings hurt more than they heal, especially when they're forced upon you by circumstances beyond your control. The call had come 3 weeks ago while she was sitting in her divorce lawyer's office in Columbus, discussing the division of assets from her 23-year marriage to Michael. Her phone had buzzed with a number she didn't recognize, and she'd almost let it go to voicemail. "Ms. Patterson, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from Millbrook General. I'm calling about your grandfather, Henry Patterson." The world had tilted sideways. In that sterile office that smelled of leather and failed dreams, Henry had died peacefully in his sleep, Dr. Chen explained. 89 years old, his heart simply decided it was time. Mrs. Mueller from next door had found him 2 days later when he didn't collect his mail, sitting in his recliner with a cup of coffee gone cold and a book of crossword puzzles open in his lap. There was a dog with him, Dr. Chen had said, an old shepherd mix. The strangest thing, the animal wouldn't leave your grandfather's side. Animal control finally managed to get him out, but he's at the shelter now. I thought you should know. Lucky. After all these years, Lucky was still alive. Eva shouldered her overnight bag and walked to the front porch, fishing the spare key from its hiding place under the 3rd loose floorboard, exactly where it had been when she was 6 years old. Some things apparently never changed. The house smelled like coffee and Old Spice and the lavender sachets Henry had started keeping in the linen closets after Eva's grandmother died. But underneath those familiar scents was something else, the particular stillness that settles into a house when the heartbeat that animated it has stopped. She set her bag down and stood in the hallway, letting the memories wash over her. Every family photograph still hung in its exact place. The kitchen table, where she'd done homework while Henry read his evening paper. The living room where they'd watched Lawrence Welk reruns and she'd fallen asleep against Lucky's warm side. More nights than she could count. The silence felt heavy, expectant, like the house itself was waiting for her to decide what came next. Eva had driven straight from Columbus to Millbrook without stopping, leaving behind the wreckage of her marriage and the job at the insurance company that had slowly drained the life from her over the past 15 years. Her children, David, 25, and Sarah, 22, were scattered across the country pursuing their own lives, and for the first time since she was 18, Eva was completely alone, or almost alone. The Millbrook Animal Shelter was a new building now, modern and clean, nothing like the converted veterinary clinic where she'd first met Lucky. The young woman at the front desk, too young to remember Eva or her family, consulted her computer with the bored efficiency of someone who dealt with surrendered animals. "Every day, Patterson," Eva said. "There should be a dog here, a German Shepherd mix. He was with my grandfather when—" She stopped, surprised by how difficult it was to say the words aloud. "Oh, yes," the woman said, her expression softening slightly. "That's Lucky, right? He's been here about 3 weeks. Has anyone explained his situation to you?" "His situation?" "Well, he's quite elderly. The vet estimates he's somewhere between 14 and 16 years old, which is really remarkable for a dog his size. But he's not doing well. He won't eat, barely moves. We've been giving him medication for pain, but honestly, we're probably looking at— I'd like to see him." The kennels were nothing like Eva remembered from her childhood, but the sound was the same. That mixture of hope and desperation that comes from animals who have learned that people can disappear without warning. She followed the staff member down a hallway lined with modern, spacious enclosures until they stopped at the last one. "Here he is." Eva looked into the kennel and felt her heart stop. It was Lucky, unmistakably Lucky, though he looked ancient. Now his once dark coat gone almost entirely grey, his body reduced to skin and bones. He lay in the far corner of the kennel, motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. But it was his eyes that made Eva sink to her knees in front of the gate. Those same ancient, knowing eyes that had gazed at her through chain link 52 years ago. Eyes that had watched her through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreak, through her wedding day and the birth of her children, through every significant moment of her life. Eyes that now opened and focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Lucky," she whispered, his head lifted slightly, ears perking forward. Then, as if someone had given him a transfusion of pure energy, he struggled to his feet and walked, slowly but deliberately, to the front of the kennel. He pressed his nose against the chain link, and when Eva reached through to touch him, he closed his eyes and leaned into her hand with a sigh that seemed to carry 5 decades of patient waiting. "I'll be damned," the staff member breathed. "He hasn't moved from that corner since he got here." Eva was crying now, tears she'd been holding back since the phone call about Henry. "How is this possible?" she asked, though she wasn't sure if she was asking the universe or Lucky himself. The mathematical impossibility of it hit her like a physical blow. Lucky had been at least 2 or 3 years old when they'd adopted him in 1972. By any reasonable calculation, he should have died 20 years ago. Yet here he was, clearly ancient but undeniably alive, looking at her with eyes that held recognition and something that looked remarkably like relief. "We can process the paperwork right now if you'd like to take him home," the staff member said gently. "Though I should warn you, the vet thinks he probably doesn't have much time left. Days, maybe weeks. It might be kinder to—" "No," Eva said, firmly, He's coming home with me. The ride back to Henry's house was surreal. Lucky lay in the passenger seat exactly as he had 52 years ago, his head resting near Eva's hand. She found herself speaking to him the way she had as a child, telling him about the divorce, about how David was in California working for a tech company and Sarah was in graduate school in Vermont, about how empty her life had felt even before Henry died. "I don't know what I'm doing, boy," she admitted as they turned into the familiar driveway. "I don't know what comes next, and I don't understand how you're still here, but I'm glad you are. God, I'm so glad you are." Lucky's tail gave a weak wag, and when she helped him out of the car, he walked directly to the front porch and settled himself in his old spot beside Henry's rocking chair, as if he'd never left. That night, Eva sat on the living room floor beside the dog bed that Henry had apparently kept in exactly the same spot for 5 decades. Lucky lay stretched out beside her, his breathing labored but steady, his eyes following her every movement. She found herself studying his face in the lamplight, searching for answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. "How, Lucky?" she whispered, stroking his graying muzzle. "How are you still here?" He looked at her with those impossibly ancient eyes, and for a moment Eva could have sworn she saw something beyond normal canine intelligence looking back at her, something that understood not just her words, but the deeper questions behind them. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the old farmhouse, and Eva realized that for the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't feel alone. Broken, confused, and facing an uncertain future, but not alone. Lucky shifted closer to her, resting his head against her leg with a contentment that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment as long as she had. As Eva drifted off to sleep, on the living room floor beside her impossible dog, she couldn't shake the feeling that coming home wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Eva woke before dawn to the sound of Lucky's nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor. In the grey morning light filtering through the kitchen windows, she watched him move through the house with a familiarity that spoke of decades spent navigating these rooms. He checked each doorway, each corner, as if conducting a security inspection he'd performed thousands of times before. When he returned to her side, settling with a soft grunt that spoke of old bones and older memories, Eva felt something shift. In her chest, this house, which had felt like a museum of her past just hours ago, suddenly felt alive again. She made coffee, using Henry's ancient percolator, the same one that had burbled on this counter every morning of her childhood. The ritual felt both foreign and deeply familiar, her hands knowing exactly where to find the filters, the coffee, the ceramic mug that had been Henry's favorite. Lucky watched from his bed, and Eva found herself narrating her movements the way she had as a child. "Remember how Grandpa always said the coffee wasn't ready until it sounded like it was having a conversation with itself?" She smiled at the memory. "You used to sit right there every morning waiting for him to drop you a piece of his toast." If summoned by the memory, Lucky rose and walked to the kitchen table, settling beside the chair that had been Henry's. The chair where he'd read his morning paper while Lucky waited patiently for crumbs of butter-soaked toast. Eva's chest tightened. She opened the refrigerator and found it still stocked with Henry's simple staples: eggs, milk, bread, the strawberry jam he'd eaten on everything. Mrs. Muller had clearly been checking on the house, making sure nothing spoiled while arrangements were made. She found herself making breakfast for 2, scrambled eggs and toast, cut into pieces small enough for Lucky to manage. When she set the plate down, he looked at her with something that might have been surprise, then ate slowly, methodically, as if he were savoring not just the food, but the simple act of being cared for. After breakfast, Eva began the overwhelming task of sorting through a lifetime of accumulated memories. Henry had been methodical about most things, but sentimental about everything. The living room contained boxes of photographs dating back to the 1940s, stacks of letters, and collections of items that had clearly held meaning for him, even if their significance was lost on anyone else. Lucky followed her from room to room, occasionally stopping to sniff at particular objects or furniture. His behavior was odd, purposeful in a way that seemed almost human. When Ava opened a closet and found boxes of her childhood belongings, Lucky sat directly in front of one specific carton, whining softly until she noticed inside were her school papers, art projects, and report cards from elementary school. But what caught her attention was what Lucky had somehow sensed: a recipe box that had belonged to her grandmother, filled with handwritten cards that documented family meals spanning decades. Each recipe was dated and annotated in her grandmother's careful script, then later in Henry's more practical handwriting. Eva's favorite birthday cake, 1978. Lucky's Christmas cookies, he likes them plain, 1985. Sunday pot roast for when Eva comes home from college, 1990. As Eva read through the cards, a pattern emerged. Every significant recipe, every special meal, every holiday tradition had been noted with the date, and increasingly often with some mention of Lucky, not just as a pet who happened to be present, but as an integral part of the family dynamic. Christmas. Morning pancakes, 1982. Lucky always knows when Ava's awake before we do. Thanksgiving turkey, 1987. Lucky sat with Eva during her first heartbreak. Made extra gravy. Ava's going away dinner before wedding, 1998. Lucky won't eat, knows she's leaving. The documentation spanned 40 years of family history, and Lucky appeared in nearly every entry, not just mentioned, but described as if he were a family member whose preferences and emotions mattered as much as anyone else's. Eva looked at Lucky, who had settled beside her on the living room floor, his eyes closed, but his breathing indicating he was awake and listening. "Grandpa wrote about you like you were his child," she said softly, "like you had feelings and opinions and—" She stopped, struck by a memory so vivid it made her dizzy. She was 16, crying in her bedroom after Bobby Hennessy had taken another girl to the homecoming dance. She'd been lying face down on her bed, sobbing into her pillow when she'd felt Lucky's weight settle beside her. Not just lying down, but positioning himself so that his body curved around her, his head resting against her back. He'd stayed there for hours, and somehow his presence had absorbed the sharp edges of her heartbreak. When she'd finally stopped, crying, and rolled over to hug him, his eyes had held an understanding that went beyond typical animal empathy. "You always knew," she whispered, reaching out to stroke his graying fur. "Whenever I was hurting, whenever I needed comfort, you always knew." The phone rang, startling them both. Ava found the cordless handset. Henry had never upgraded to cell phones, and saw Michael's number on the caller ID. She almost didn't answer. Their last conversation had ended with lawyers and accusations, and the kind of bitter words that can't be unsaid. But something about Lucky's steady presence gave her courage. "Hello, Michael." "Eva." His voice sounded tired, older than she remembered. "I heard about Henry. I'm sorry." The genuine sympathy in his tone caught her off guard. Despite everything that had gone wrong between them, Michael had loved Henry. Her grandfather had been one of the few people who'd never taken sides during the divorce, maintaining his quiet affection for the man who'd been part of his family. Over 2 decades. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." "Are you okay? David said you were staying at the house." "I'm managing. There's a lot to sort through." "I remember." Henry never threw anything away. There was a pause. "Listen, I know this isn't the best timing, but the lawyers need to finalize the property division. Your half of the house sale, the retirement accounts. Michael, I can't deal with that right now." "I know, but Eva, you need to think about your future. You're 58 years old, you don't have a job, and your kids aren't going to support you forever. The Columbus house sold. The papers are ready to sign. I said I can't deal with this right now." Lucky had moved closer during the conversation, pressing against her leg as if he could sense her rising stress. "Fine," Michael said, his voice cooling. "But you can't hide out in that old house forever. Real life is waiting for you whether you're ready or not." After she hung up, Eva sat in silence, stroking Lucky's head while her anxiety churned. Michael wasn't wrong. She did need to figure out what came next. At 58, with no career prospects and a failed marriage behind her, her options felt limited and frightening. But as Lucky settled his chin on her knee and looked at her, with those ancient, patient eyes, Eva felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The afternoon brought visitors. Mrs. Muller from next door, carrying a casserole and stories about how Henry had spoken of Eva constantly. The mailman, who remembered when Eva was small enough to hide behind Henry's legs. Dr. Morrison's son, who now ran the veterinary practice and wanted to check on Lucky. Each visitor shared memories of Henry, but they also shared memories of Lucky. Stories that spanned decades, told by people who had watched the dog grow from a rescued stray to a neighborhood fixture. "That dog of your grandfather's," Mrs. Muller said, shaking her head. "Strangest thing I ever saw. 40 years I lived next to Henry, and that dog never seemed to age a day after his first few years. Same energy, same habits, same way of watching. Over people. Dogs don't live that long," Dr. Morrison Jr. said when he examined Lucky that evening. "But his paperwork shows he's been a patient here since 1972. That's impossible, but the records don't lie." Eva watched Lucky submit patiently to the examination, allowing the vet to check his heart and joints and eyes. The diagnosis was what she'd expected. Very old, arthritic, but remarkably healthy for an animal of his apparent age. "Keep him comfortable," Dr. Morrison Jr. advised. "Make sure he eats regularly. Don't let him overexert himself. But honestly, Mrs. Morrison, I've never seen an animal his age with this much vitality. It's like he's got something to live for." As the vet's truck pulled away, Eva sat on the front porch, with Lucky beside her, watching the sun set over the same fields she'd explored as a child. The weight of decisions about the house, about her future, about what came next, pressed down on her shoulders. But Lucky's steady breathing beside her, the familiar rhythm of his presence, made everything feel manageable. Not solved, but manageable. "What am I going to do, boy?" she asked. Lucky looked at her with those impossibly wise eyes, and for just a moment Eva could have sworn she saw an answer there. "Stay," those eyes seemed to say. "There's more here than you realize." The next morning brought revelations hidden in the most ordinary places. Eva had decided to tackle Henry's bedroom, steeling herself for the emotional weight of sorting through his most personal belongings. Lucky followed her upstairs, his movement slower on the steps but determined. The bedroom looked exactly as it had during her childhood visits. The same oak dresser her grandmother had chosen, the same faded quilt, the same photograph of Eva's parents on their wedding day. But it was what she found in Henry's nightstand that stopped her cold. Veterinary records, dozens of them, spanning from 1972 to just last month. Each one carefully filed and annotated in Henry's precise handwriting. Eva spread them across the bed, Lucky watching from his position by the window. The progression was impossible to ignore and impossible to explain. The earliest records from Dr. Morrison Sr. estimated Lucky's age at 2 to 3 years when they'd adopted him. Normal enough. But then came years of annual checkups, vaccinations, and routine care that painted a picture defying natural law. SM25. Patient appears healthy, estimate age 5 to 6 years. 1980. Excellent health, estimate age 7 to 8 years. 1985. Remarkable condition, estimate age 8, 9 years. 1990. Patient showing minimal signs of aging, estimate age 9 to 10 years. Henry's notations in the margins grew more puzzled over time. Dr. Morrison can't explain it. Asked about diet, told him nothing special. Vet thinks he miscalculated earlier ages. By 1995, Dr. Morrison Sr. had apparently given up trying to age Lucky accurately, simply noting mature adult in his records. But Henry's personal notes revealed his growing bewilderment. 23 years old and still acts like middle age. "How?" Eva called from college. Lucky knew she was upset before. Phone rang. Dog shouldn't be alive, but here he is. Eva found herself sinking onto the bed, surrounded by decades of documentation that confirmed what her heart already knew. Lucky wasn't bound by the normal rules that govern the lives of dogs, or perhaps any living thing. Among the veterinary records was a small notebook she'd never seen before, filled with Henry's observations about Lucky's behavior. The entries read like a naturalist's field notes, documenting not just physical health, but emotional intelligence, and what could only be described as supernatural awareness. July 15th, 1976. Lucky knew about Eva's diabetes before we did. Started nudging her to eat at regular intervals 3 days before first episode. December 22nd, 1982, Dog positioned himself between Eva and icy steps she couldn't see. Prevented fall. March 3rd, 1988, Lucky howling at 3 a.m. for no reason. Got call about Jim's mother's stroke at 3:15. June 18th, 1992, Eva's wedding day. Lucky refused to leave her side during photos. Photographer complained. Later learned Michael's best man had been drinking and planned to make inappropriate speech. Lucky's presence somehow prevented it. Page after page documented moments when Lucky had displayed knowledge he couldn't possibly possess, protection that went beyond animal instinct, and an understanding of human emotions that bordered on psychic. Eva looked at Lucky, who had moved closer during her reading, and was now resting his chin on the bed beside the scattered papers. His eyes held their familiar wisdom, but now she saw something else there, a kind of patient waiting, as if he'd known this moment would come eventually. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, are you okay? David said you're staying at Great-Grandpa's house indefinitely. Call me." Before Eva could respond, another message arrived, this one from her old college roommate Jennifer. "Saw on Facebook about Henry. So sorry, honey. Remember what a character that dog of his was? Swear he was psychic." The word psychic made Eva's hands tremble as she set the phone aside. She wasn't ready to explain what she was discovering, wasn't sure she could explain it without sounding like grief had unhinged her mind. But the evidence was mounting, documented in Henry's careful handwriting over decades of observation. She found her high school yearbook in a box marked Eva's School Years and flipped through pages that chronicled her awkward teenage years. But it wasn't her own photos that caught her attention. It was the inscriptions from classmates. "Eva, your dog is amazing. How did he know I was allergic to bees before I did? Susan K. Never forget junior year when Lucky somehow got loose and found you at the lake when Brad was being a creep. Best bodyguard ever. Michelle, that dog of yours always showed up at exactly the right moments. Magic. Tommy R. Lucky knew I was sad about my parents' divorce before I told anyone. Dogs don't usually do that. Karen." Each inscription reinforced what the veterinary records and Henry's notes had documented. Lucky possessed an awareness that transcended normal animal behavior. Her classmates had noticed it. Her grandfather had documented it. And now Eva was forced to confront the impossible truth her rational mind had been avoiding. Lucky wasn't just unusually long-lived. He was something else entirely. That afternoon, Eva called Jennifer, needing to hear a familiar voice from a time when her world made sense. "Eva, I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up?" "I'm okay, confused, but okay." Eva looked at Lucky, who was dozing in a patch of sunlight. "Jen, you mentioned Lucky being psychic. What did you mean?" Jennifer laughed. "Oh, honey, you remember? That dog of Henry's always knew things he shouldn't have known. Remember when we were home for Christmas senior year and I was being all secretive about dating that married professor?" Lucky took one look at me and started growling. Not at me, but like he was warning me about something. 3 days later, I found out the guy was telling the same lies to 2 other students. "You never told me that story. I told you Lucky was a better judge of character than I was. You just laughed and said he was protective of family friends." Jennifer's voice grew thoughtful. "You know, I always wondered about that dog. I swear he looked exactly the same from the time you were 6 until I saw him at your wedding 20. Years later, same face, same energy. It was uncanny. After the call, Eva sat in Henry's kitchen with a cup of tea and a growing sense that everything she thought she understood about her life was about to change. The accumulated evidence, veterinary records, personal observations, testimonials from friends and neighbors, painted a picture that challenged everything she believed about the natural world. Lucky had lived with her family for over 50 years, displaying intelligence and awareness that defied explanation. He had protected her, guided her, and somehow known things that should have been impossible for any animal to know. But if Lucky wasn't exactly an animal, if he was something more, then what was he? And why had he chosen her family? That evening, Dr. Morrison Jr. stopped by to check on Lucky's condition. Eva found herself studying the young veterinarian as he examined the dog, wondering if he saw what she was beginning to see. "How old do you think he really is?" she asked as Dr. Morrison listened to Lucky's heart. "Honestly, based on his physical condition, I'd say 14 or 15. But his paperwork shows he's been our patient since 1972. That would make him at least 50 years old, which is impossible." He looked up from Lucky's chart. "My father mentioned this discrepancy to me before he retired. Said it was the strangest case he'd ever encountered. What did he think was happening?" Dr. Morrison shrugged. "Dad was a practical man, but he always said there were things in this world that couldn't be explained by textbooks. He thought Lucky might be one of those things. And what do you think?" The young vet was quiet for a moment, studying Lucky's calm, intelligent eyes. "I think your grandfather was lucky to have him, regardless of how old he really is. And I think Lucky's been waiting for you to come home." After Dr. Morrison left, Eva sat on the living room floor beside Lucky, surrounded by the evidence of his impossible existence. The dog looked at her with those ancient eyes, and she finally asked the question that had been building in her mind all day. "What are you, Lucky? Really?" Lucky tilted his head slightly, and for a moment Eva thought she saw something flicker in his expression, a kind of recognition that her question wasn't rhetorical. He stood slowly, walked to the old oak bookshelf where Henry had kept his reading material, and sat directly in front of one particular shelf. His tail wagged once, deliberately, and he looked back at Eva as if to say, "Check here." Eva's hands shook as she approached the bookshelf. The section Lucky had indicated contained Henry's collection of books about faith, philosophy, and what he'd always called life's mysteries. Books about angels, about divine intervention, about the thin places where the spiritual world touched the ordinary one. Hidden among the familiar titles was a small leather journal she'd never seen before, bound with a ribbon and marked with Henry's initials. As Eva untied the ribbon with trembling fingers, Lucky returned to her side and settled against her leg, as if he knew what she was about to discover would change everything. The first entry was dated 3 months after they'd brought Lucky home from the shelter. "I don't know what Eva and I brought into this house, but it isn't just a dog." Today he knew she was having a nightmare before she started crying. He was at her bedside before she woke up, and when she opened her eyes, she wasn't afraid. She smiled and said, "I dreamed about Mommy and Daddy, but Lucky kept me safe." How does a dog keep a child safe in her dreams? Eva's vision blurred as she realized she was about to read 50 years of her grandfather's private thoughts about the impossible creature who had shared their lives. And somewhere in those pages she suspected lay the answer to questions she was only beginning to know how to ask. Eva spent that night reading Henry's journal by lamplight, Lucky pressed against her side, as if he understood the significance of what she was discovering. Each entry revealed another layer of the mystery that had lived quietly in their family. For 5 decades, November 1972, Eva talks to Lucky like he's a person, and I swear he responds like one. Not the way dogs usually respond to their names or commands, but like he's actually listening to what she's saying and thinking about it. January 1974. Lucky somehow got out of the yard and showed up at Eva's school during a fire drill. Teacher said he appeared out of nowhere and stayed beside Eva until they gave the all clear. How did he know? How did he get past the fence? September 1979. Eva's first day of high school. She was nervous, didn't want to go. Lucky positioned himself between her and the front door, wouldn't let her leave until she'd eaten breakfast and taken her lunch. Like he knew she'd need her strength for what was coming. The entries painted a picture of vigilant protection that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Lucky didn't just react to situations, he anticipated them, sometimes preventing problems before they occurred. But it was the letters Eva found tucked between the journal pages that truly broke her heart. Letters she had written to Henry over the years, whenever life had become overwhelming and she'd needed his steady wisdom. Letters she'd forgotten writing, but which Henry had kept and organized chronologically. Each letter mentioned Lucky, not as an afterthought or casual reference, but as an essential part of whatever crisis she was navigating. March 1986, during her freshman year at Ohio State. Grandpa, I'm so homesick I can barely function. My roommate thinks I'm weird for missing a dog, but it's not just that I miss him. It's like part of my strength stayed home with Lucky. Does that make any sense? When I was little and had nightmares, he would somehow know before I even woke up. He'd be there, and just seeing him made everything okay. I could use that kind of certainty right now. August 1991, written from her first apartment in Columbus. The job interview is next week, and I'm terrified I'm not qualified. I keep thinking about how Lucky always seemed to know when I needed extra confidence. Remember how he'd sit with me before school presentations, like he was lending me his calm. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear I could feel his strength flowing into me during those moments. December 1995, during her engagement to Michael. I had the strangest dream about Lucky last night. He was sitting between me and Michael, and he looked worried. Not about Michael specifically, but like he could see something I couldn't see. When I called this morning, you said Lucky had been restless all night. Grandpa, do you think dogs can sense things about people? About futures? Eva remembered writing that letter, remembered the vague unease she'd felt during her engagement. She'd dismissed it as pre-wedding nerves, but looking back now, she wondered if Lucky had tried to warn her about incompatibilities that wouldn't become obvious until years later. April 2003, after her miscarriage. I can't stop crying. The doctor says these things happen, that it doesn't mean anything about future pregnancies, but I feel like I've failed at something fundamental. Michael tries to be supportive, but he doesn't understand how this feels. I keep wishing Lucky was here. He always knew how to absorb sadness, how to make pain feel manageable. Even writing his name makes me feel a little less alone. Reading her own words from 20 years ago, Eva remembered that terrible spring when hope had turned to loss seemingly overnight. She'd been 26 weeks pregnant, far enough along to have chosen names and prepared a nursery. The grief had been devastating, and Michael's practical response had been their first serious marital crack. But she also remembered calling Henry that night, sobbing into the phone, and hearing Lucky barking softly in the background. Not distressed barking, but the gentle woofing he'd always done when he sensed strong emotions and wanted to offer comfort. "He knows you're hurting," Henry had said. "Been pacing all evening like he wants to come to you, but knows he can't." The next letter was dated 2 weeks later. "Grandpa, thank you for driving Lucky all the way to Columbus yesterday. I know it was 4 hours each way and you hate city traffic, but having him here for the afternoon saved me. Michael thinks I'm being ridiculous, getting so much comfort from a dog, but Lucky understood my sadness in a way no human could. When he put his head on my lap and looked at me with those wise eyes, I felt like someone was telling me I'd be okay. That this pain had a purpose, even if I couldn't see it yet." Eva wiped her eyes and looked at Lucky, who had been watching her read with an expression of infinite patience. "You came to comfort me when I lost the baby. You always came when I..." Needed you most. Lucky's tail wagged once, a gentle acknowledgement. The pattern continued through decades of correspondence. Lucky appeared in every major life event, every crisis, every moment when Ava had needed strength beyond her own. Her wedding, where he'd somehow sensed her doubts, the births of David and Sarah, where he'd waited outside the hospital for news. Her father-in-law's funeral, where he'd appeared at her side despite being supposedly locked in Henry's house 30 miles away. The most recent letter was dated just 6 months ago, written during the worst period of her divorce. Grandpa, I know I haven't visited in too long, but everything here is falling apart. Michael and I can barely be in the same room without fighting. The kids are taking sides, the lawyers are circling like vultures, and I feel like I'm losing myself in all this ugliness. I keep thinking about Lucky, about how he used to make everything feel manageable just by being there. I know he's old now, probably doesn't have many years left, but could I bring the kids to see him soon? We all need his particular brand of peace right now. Henry had written a response on the back of her letter. Ava will always be welcome here, and so will David and Sarah. Lucky asks about them constantly, not in words, of course, but in the way he watches the driveway and perks up when the phone rings. He knows this family's hurting, and he wants to help. That's what he does. That's what he's always done. Below Henry's response was a postscript that made Eva's breath catch. I don't think Lucky ages the way other dogs do, because his work isn't finished. Some creatures are sent to love us through the hardest parts of life, and they stay until that love isn't needed anymore. Ava's still healing, still growing into who she's meant to be. Lucky will be here until that process is complete. Ava closed the letter with shaking hands. Henry had known, not just about Lucky's impossible longevity, but about his purpose. Her grandfather had understood that Lucky wasn't simply a pet. He was a guardian, a guide, something sent to help their family navigate loss and find their way back to wholeness. Is that true? She whispered to Lucky. Are you here until I figure out how to be okay on my own? Lucky tilted his head and gave her the same look he'd given that 6-year-old girl in the animal shelter 52 years ago. Patient, knowing, and filled with a love that transcended normal understanding. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the old windows and reminding Ava that winter was coming. But inside Henry's house, surrounded by evidence of a love that had watched over her family for 5 decades, she felt warmer than she had in years. Whatever Lucky was, guardian angel, divine intervention, or something beyond human comprehension, he had shaped every important moment of her life. He had been her constant through loss and change, her source of strength when her own reserves ran empty. And now, as she faced the biggest transition of her adult life, he was still here, still watching over her with those ancient, loving eyes, still waiting to see what she would become next. The next morning, Eva discovered Henry's final letter to her hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk, sealed in an envelope marked, "For Ava, when Lucky brings you home." Her hands trembled as she broke the seal, Lucky watching from his position by the window where the morning sun caught the silver in his coat. "My dearest Eva," the letter began in Henry's careful script, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Lucky has done what I always knew he would. He's brought you back to where you belong." Eva sank into Henry's desk chair, feeling the weight of words written by a man who'd known he was approaching the end of his life. "I need to tell you things I should have said years ago, things I kept to myself because I thought you weren't ready to hear them. But a man doesn't get to choose his timing when it comes to dying, so I'm trusting that whenever you find this letter, it will be the right moment. Lucky isn't what he appears to be. I think you've begun to suspect this already, given how long he's lived and how much he seems to understand. I've had 50 years to observe him, to document his impossible behaviors and try to make sense of what he is. The truth is, I don't think Lucky ages because his purpose transcends the normal rules of life and death. He was sent to our family, first to help me deal with losing your grandmother, then to help both of us heal from losing Sarah and Jim, and finally to help you navigate whatever challenges life would bring." Eva paused, wiping her eyes. Henry had rarely spoken about her grandmother's death, which had occurred just 2 months before Eva's parents' accident. She'd never realized how devastating that double loss must have been for him, losing his wife and his daughter in the same year, then suddenly finding himself responsible for a 6-year-old child. The letter continued, "I was drowning when Lucky came into our lives, completely drowning. I'd buried the woman I'd loved for 40 years, I'd lost my only child, and I was trying to raise a traumatized little girl when I could barely get out of bed myself. I prayed for help, Eva. I got down on my knees in this very room and begged God to send me strength to take care of you properly. 3 days later, we were at the animal shelter, and you chose the one dog that no one else wanted. The dog that should have died from his injuries, but somehow survived. The dog that looked at both of us like he'd been waiting his entire life to find us." Eva remembered that day with sudden clarity, not just her own 6-year-old perspective, but now understanding Henry's desperation, his fear that he wasn't equipped to raise a child at his age. "Lucky saved us both, Eva, not just by being a good pet, but by giving us something to focus on besides our grief. Taking care of him taught us how to take care of each other. His presence made the house feel less empty, made our small family feel complete. But more than that, he's been watching over you your entire life. I documented it all. Every time. He knew about your problems before they happened, every crisis where he appeared exactly when you needed him most. He's been your guardian angel with 4 paws and a tail." The letter detailed observations Eva had already discovered in Henry's journal, but his final letter provided context she hadn't understood. "When you were 8 and fell through the ice on Miller's Pond, Lucky started howling and running toward the woods 20 minutes before you came home, soaking wet and hypothermic. He led me straight to you. When you were 16 and that boy from school was pressuring you at the summer dance, Lucky somehow got loose and appeared at the community center. The chaperone said he walked right up to you and positioned himself between you and that young man until you were ready to leave safely. When you were in college and got food poisoning from that campus restaurant, Lucky started pacing and whining 3 hours before the call came. He knew you were in the hospital before any of us did. During your marriage troubles, he would get restless whenever you were having particularly difficult days, even though you were hundreds of miles away. It was like he could feel your distress across the distance." Eva remembered each incident Henry described, but she'd never connected them to Lucky's supernatural awareness. She'd thought they were coincidences, or the kind of stories families tell themselves to make sense of random events. "I believe Lucky was sent to love us through the hardest parts of life," Henry's letter continued, "not just as a pet, but as something more, a guardian spirit, if you will, a divine intervention disguised as a dog. But Eva, I also believe his time with our family is coming to an end, not because he's dying, I don't think Lucky dies the way other creatures do, but because his work here is nearly finished. You're stronger now than you've ever been, even if you don't see it yet. The scared little girl who needed a protector has grown into a woman who can stand on her own. Lucky has been preparing you for this moment your entire life. Every crisis he helped you through, every challenge he gave you strength to face, has been building toward the person you're meant to become. Someone who doesn't need a guardian anymore because she's learned to be her own source of strength." Eva looked at Lucky, who had moved closer during her reading and was now resting his head against her knee. His eyes held the same infinite patience they'd always held, but now she saw something else there. A kind of peaceful acceptance, as if he too understood that their time together was approaching its natural conclusion. "I don't know what will happen when Lucky's work is finished," Henry's letter concluded. "Maybe he'll move on to another family that needs him. Maybe he'll simply fade away like morning mist. But I know this. The love he's given you will remain. The strength he's helped you build will remain. The capacity for healing and helping others that he's nurtured in you will remain. You were meant for something important, Eva. Lucky has been preparing you for it your entire life. Trust in that preparation. Trust in the strength you've learned from loving something so completely that you can let it go when the time comes. Take care of our boy for as long as he needs you to, and when it's time for him to go, let him go with gratitude rather than grief. He has given us more than any family deserves. All my love, Grandpa Henry. P.S. Check the attic. There's something up there you need to see. Eva sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time after finishing the letter, absorbing the weight of Henry's revelations. Lucky remained beside her, occasionally nuzzling her hand as if to reassure her that he was still there, still watching over her, even as they both acknowledged that their extraordinary partnership was entering its final chapter. The afternoon sun was slanting through the kitchen windows when Eva finally climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, Lucky following more slowly. Behind her, the space under the eaves was dusty and warm, filled with the accumulated history of 3 generations of Pattersons. But in the center of the room, illuminated by a shaft of sunlight from the small window, sat a cedar chest Eva had never seen before. Inside the chest was a collection that took her breath away, dozens of photographs spanning 50 years, all featuring Lucky, not family snapshots where he happened to appear, but careful portraits documenting his presence throughout her life. Lucky as a young dog, sitting beside 6-year-old Eva on her first day of school. Lucky in his prime, watching over teenage Eva as she studied at the kitchen table. Lucky in middle age, positioned between Eva and Michael during their wedding photos with an expression that now seemed prophetic. Lucky last spring, his coat silver with age, but his eyes still bright with purpose, sitting beside Henry on the front porch, where they'd spent countless evenings together. At the bottom of the chest was a final photograph, recent, taken with Henry's old Polaroid camera. It showed Lucky alone in the living room, but the lighting and composition suggested he was posing, as if he'd known this would be his final portrait. On the back, Henry had written, "For Eva, so she'll remember that some love is eternal." As Eva held the photograph, Lucky climbed the attic stairs and settled beside her among the evidence of their shared history. Together they sat in the dusty afternoon light, surrounded by the proof of an impossible love story that had shaped both their lives. And for the first time since returning to Millbrook, Eva understood what Henry had been trying to tell her. Lucky hadn't just been her pet, her protector, or even her guardian angel. He had been her teacher, showing her how to love so completely that she could eventually love herself. The lessons were almost complete, which meant their time together was running out. That evening, Eva followed Henry's final instruction and searched through his desk for the combination to the old safe hidden behind the bookshelf. A safe she'd never known existed. The combination was written in his careful script on a piece of paper tucked inside his Bible. Eva's birthday, Lucky's arrival. Her fingers shook as she dialed the numbers, 05-16-66, then 10-15-72. The safe opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the quiet house. Inside, wrapped in soft velvet, was an object that defied everything she thought she understood about Lucky's origins. It was a collar. Not the simple leather one Lucky had worn for as long as she could remember, but an ancient thing made of what looked like hammered silver and leather, so old it had turned nearly black with age. Carved into the metal were symbols Eva didn't recognize, spirals and stars and shapes that seemed to shift in the lamplight, but it was the tag that made her sink to her knees in front of the open safe. The tag was made of the same ancient silver, heavier than it should have been for its size. Engraved on one side was a single word in letters that seemed to glow with their own light, Guardian. On the other side was a date that made Eva's vision blur, AD 1247. Lucky had been watching from the doorway, but now he approached slowly and sat directly in front of her, his ancient eyes fixed on the collar with an expression Eva had never seen before. Recognition mixed with something that looked like relief. With trembling hands, Eva lifted the collar from the safe. It was warm to the touch, and as she held it, images flashed through her mind like memories that weren't her own. A plague-ravaged village in medieval England, where a dog with Lucky's exact features comforted a dying child. A prairie homestead in 1800s Kansas, where that same dog guided a lost family through a blizzard. A tenement building in 1920s New York, where he sat vigil beside a woman in labor, somehow knowing she would need his strength to survive. A London bomb shelter in 1941, where children huddled against his warm side while the city burned above them. Image after image, century after century, always the same dog appearing wherever families needed a guardian, a protector, a source of unconditional love during their darkest hours. Eva dropped the collar with a gasp, the visions fading as suddenly as they'd come. Lucky tilted his head, studying her with those impossibly wise eyes, and Eva finally understood why they'd always seemed so familiar, so knowing. They weren't the eyes of a dog who had lived 50 years. They were the eyes of a creature who had witnessed centuries of human suffering and chosen, again and again, to ease that suffering through perfect, patient love. "You're not just my guardian," she whispered. "You're a guardian. You've been doing this for hundreds of years." Lucky's tail wagged once, a gentle confirmation. "How many families have you saved? How many children have you watched grow up and move on?" He approached her slowly, pressing his graying muzzle against her hand. In that touch, Eva felt the weight of centuries, hundreds of families who had loved him completely, never knowing they were caring for something far more precious than they could imagine. She thought about all the moments when Lucky had appeared, exactly when she needed him most, all the times he'd displayed knowledge that should have been impossible. Now she understood. It wasn't supernatural intuition. It was the accumulated wisdom of a being who had been watching over humanity for nearly 800 years. "The families before us," Eva said, her voice breaking. "Did they know what you were?" Lucky's eyes grew sad, and somehow Eva understood that most of them hadn't. They'd loved him as a pet, mourned him as a pet, and never realized they'd been caring for something divine. But Henry had known. Henry had figured it out and documented everything, leaving Eva the evidence she needed to understand the truth. "That's why you don't age normally," she continued, pieces falling into place. "That's why you always know when someone's in danger, why you can sense emotions, why you appear exactly when families need you most. You're not bound by the same rules as ordinary creatures." Lucky moved closer, settling his head in her lap the way he had when she was 6 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. But now Eva understood that his comfort came from centuries of practice, from watching over countless children who had needed his protection. She picked up the ancient collar again, and this time the visions came more gently, not overwhelming. Flashes, but clear pictures of Lucky's long journey through history. She saw him choosing families the way he'd chosen hers, always the ones who needed him most. Always the broken ones, the grieving ones, the lost ones who required the kind of love that could transcend ordinary understanding. She saw him staying with each family until his work was complete, until the children grew strong enough to face the world on their own, until the parents learned to heal, until the household no longer needed a guardian's protection. And then she saw him leaving, not dying, but simply fading from their lives, like a dream half remembered upon waking, moving on to the next family who needed him. "How do you choose?" she asked. "How do you know which families need you?" The answer came not in words, but in a feeling that filled her chest with warmth. Love called to love, pain called to comfort, broken hearts called to the one whose purpose was mending them. Eva understood now why Lucky had seemed to age so slowly during her childhood and teenage years, then remained essentially unchanged through her adult life. He aged with purpose, not with time. As long as his family needed him to be strong and vital, he remained so. But now, as she looked into his ancient eyes, she could see the truth Henry had recognized in his final letter. Lucky's work with the Patterson family was nearly complete. She had grown into a woman who could face life's challenges without needing a guardian's constant protection. She had learned, through 50 years of Lucky's patient teaching, how to love others unconditionally and how to find strength in that love. She was ready to stand on her own, which meant Lucky was ready to move on to the next family who needed him. When? She whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Lucky lifted his head and looked toward the window, where the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. Something in his expression told her that the time was very soon, perhaps sooner than she was prepared to face. But as Ava held the ancient collar that had traveled through centuries with her beloved guardian, she realized that knowing the truth, understanding Lucky's divine purpose, made the approaching goodbye both more painful and more bearable. More painful because she now understood exactly what she was losing, not just a pet, but a piece of heaven that had chosen to love her family for 5 decades. More bearable because she finally understood that Lucky's love for her had always been preparing her for this moment, teaching her to be strong enough to let him go when his purpose was fulfilled. The greatest act of love, she realized, would be releasing him to continue his sacred work, even if it meant facing the rest of her life without him. Outside, the October wind carried the first hint of winter, and Eva knew with certainty that the season of her guardian was drawing to a close. All that remained was learning how to say goodbye to a love that had shaped her entire existence. Over the next 3 days, Eva found herself moving through Henry's house like she was walking through a living memory. Every room, every corner, every piece of furniture held evidence of Lucky's impossible presence throughout her life. But now, armed with the knowledge of his true nature, she began to see patterns that had been invisible before. In her childhood bedroom, she discovered a collection of drawings she'd made between ages 6 and 12, carefully preserved in a portfolio Henry had created. Drawing after drawing showed Lucky, but not as the dog others would have seen. In her child's imagination, she'd drawn him with wings, with halos, with a golden light surrounding his form. "Angel Dog," read the caption on one drawing in her 6-year-old handwriting. "Lucky keeps me safe," said another, showing a figure with Lucky's unmistakable features standing guard beside her bed. "My best friend from heaven," proclaimed a third, depicting Lucky and Ava walking together down a path that disappeared into clouds. Eva stared at the drawings with wonder. Somehow, her child's heart had known what her adult mind had taken 50 years to understand. She'd always sensed Lucky's divine nature, had always felt the otherworldly love that radiated from him. Lucky appeared in the doorway, moving more slowly now, but still with that purposeful grace that had characterized his movements for as long as she could remember. He studied the drawings spread across her childhood bed, his ancient eyes holding a kind of gentle amusement. "I knew, didn't I?" Ava said softly. "Part of me always knew you weren't ordinary." Lucky approached the bed and carefully, deliberately placed his paw on one specific drawing. Ava looked at the image he'd chosen, a crayon portrait of the two of them sitting together under a tree, both surrounded by what her younger self had depicted as sparkles of light. But it wasn't the drawing itself that caught her attention. It was what she'd written across the bottom in letters that took up half the page. "Lucky will be with me forever and ever." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her 6-year-old self had somehow understood that Lucky's love would transcend the normal boundaries of a pet's lifespan, but she'd interpreted that as a promise of forever. Now she understood the cruel paradox. Lucky's love would indeed be with her forever, but Lucky himself was preparing to leave. That afternoon, Dr. Morrison Jr. made an unexpected visit. Ava found him standing on the front porch, his expression serious in a way that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by without calling," he said, "but I've been thinking about Lucky, and there are some things we should discuss." They sat in Henry's living room, Lucky stretched out on his bed, but clearly listening to every word. Dr. Morrison pulled out a file that Eva recognized as Lucky's medical records. "I've been going through my father's notes," he began carefully. "Not just the official records, but his personal observations. Mrs. Patterson, Eva, my father documented some very unusual things about Lucky over the years." "What kind of things?" "Behaviors that suggested Lucky possessed knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. Awareness of medical conditions before symptoms appeared. Reactions to situations that hadn't happened yet." Dr. Morrison paused, studying Lucky with professional curiosity. "My father was a practical man, but he believed there were aspects of Lucky that couldn't be explained by conventional veterinary science." Eva nodded, her hand instinctively moving to stroke Lucky's head. "What did your father think was happening?" "He thought Lucky was what he called a bridge creature, something that exists between our world and whatever comes next. A being whose purpose is to help families transition through their most difficult periods." Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "Eva, my father documented over 40 years of Lucky's presence in this community, not just with your family, but his influence on everyone who encountered him. The number of times he appeared at exactly the right moment to prevent accidents, comfort the grieving, or guide lost children home. It goes far beyond coincidence." "Did your father ever share these observations with Henry?" "They talked about it, yes, especially in recent years. Henry knew Lucky wasn't ordinary, and my father confirmed that from a medical standpoint, Lucky's longevity and behavior patterns were impossible." Dr. Morrison glanced at Lucky, who had opened his eyes and was watching the conversation intently. "But there's something else you should know. My father believed Lucky's time with your family was approaching its end." Eva's chest tightened. "What made him think that?" "Lucky's behavior in recent months. He'd been coming to our clinic not because he was sick, but because he seemed to be saying goodbye. Letting my father examine him one last time, allowing him to document his condition for posterity. Animals don't usually do that unless they're preparing for something significant." The weight of inevitability settled over Eva like a heavy blanket. Everyone who had truly known Lucky, Henry, Dr. Morrison Sr., and now Dr. Morrison Jr., had recognized that his departure was imminent. "How long do we have?" she asked, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Lucky with the kind of careful attention veterinarians reserved for the most complex cases. "Based on his recent behavior and my father's notes, I'd say very soon, perhaps within the week." After Dr. Morrison left, Eva called her children. The conversations were difficult. How do you explain to your adult children that their childhood dog is actually an immortal guardian angel whose divine mission is nearly complete? David, practical like his father, listened with the polite patience of someone humoring a grieving relative. "Mum, I know you're going through a lot right now with Grandpa Henry's death and the divorce. Sometimes grief can make us see patterns that aren't really there." Sarah, more intuitive, seemed to sense something deeper in Eva's words. "Mom, Lucky always was special. I remember things about him that never made sense, like how he knew when I was going to have an asthma attack before I felt it coming, or how he appeared in my dorm room during my freshman year breakdown when he was supposedly locked in Grandpa's house 200 miles away. You remember that?" "I remember a lot of things about Lucky that seemed impossible at the time. I just told myself I was imagining things." Sarah's voice grew thoughtful. "If you're saying he's something more than an ordinary dog, I believe you. I think I always believed it, somewhere deep down. Would you come home, both of you? If this is really Lucky's goodbye, I think he'd want you here." "Of course, Mom. I'll drive down tomorrow." David agreed to fly in from California, though Eva could hear the skepticism in his voice. But she knew that once he saw Lucky again, once he looked into those ancient, knowing eyes, he would remember the inexplicable moments of his own childhood, when Lucky had seemed more like a guardian angel than a pet. That evening, Eva sat in the living room with Lucky, surrounded by all the evidence she'd gathered of his impossible existence. The veterinary records, Henry's journal, her childhood drawings, the ancient collar that had traveled through centuries, all of it painting the picture of a love that transcended normal understanding. "Tomorrow the kids will be here," she told. Lucky, who had positioned himself so that he was touching her leg, as if he needed the physical connection as much as she did. They should have a chance to say goodbye properly. Lucky's tail wagged softly, but his eyes held a sadness that Eva had never seen before. Not the sadness of a sick animal, but the sadness of someone who had loved deeply and was preparing to leave that love behind. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Lucky tilted his head, considering the question with the same seriousness he'd always brought to her concerns. Then he moved closer, resting his head in her lap, and Eva felt a wave of peace wash over her. Not his peace, she realized, but her own. The peace he'd been teaching her to find within herself for 50 years. He wasn't afraid, because fear was an emotion tied to uncertainty. Lucky knew exactly what came next, had known from the moment. He'd chosen her family in that animal shelter 5 decades ago. His work here was nearly complete, and he was ready to move on to whatever divine purpose awaited him. The question was whether Eva was ready to let him go. As she stroked his graying fur and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing, Eva realized that Lucky had spent 50 years preparing her for this exact moment. Every crisis he'd helped her weather, every challenge he'd given her strength to face, had been building toward this final test of love. Could she love him enough to release him? Could she find the strength to say goodbye to the being who had taught her everything she knew about unconditional love? Outside, the autumn night was crisp and clear, filled with stars that seemed unusually bright. Eva had the strangest feeling that the universe itself was preparing for Lucky's departure, that creation was getting ready to welcome home one of its most faithful servants. Tomorrow her children would arrive, and they would have their chance to say goodbye to the guardian who had shaped their childhoods in ways they were only beginning to understand. But tonight was just for her and Lucky. 50 years of shared history settling into its final chapter. Two souls who had been bound together by divine intervention, preparing to face the most difficult goodbye of their lives. Eva looked into Lucky's ancient eyes and saw her own reflection there, but also something more. She saw the 6-year-old girl who had chosen a broken dog because she recognized the brokenness in herself. She saw the teenager who had found courage in Lucky's steady presence. She saw the young woman who had learned to love by watching Lucky love unconditionally. She saw a lifetime of being shaped by divine love. And finally, she saw a woman who was strong enough to stand on her own. Lucky had completed his work, which meant tomorrow would be about saying goodbye to the greatest love she had ever known. Sarah arrived first, just after sunrise, her car crunching on the gravel driveway like a heartbeat announcing momentous change. Eva watched from the kitchen window as her daughter sat in the car for several minutes, gathering courage for whatever. Goodbye waited inside. Lucky had been awake since before dawn, positioned by the front door as if he'd known exactly when Sarah would arrive. His tail wagged slowly when he heard her footsteps on the porch, but there was something ceremonial about his posture, like a soldier preparing for inspection. When Sarah entered the house, she stopped dead in the doorway. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Mom, he looks exactly the same." It was true. Despite his advanced age, despite the gray in his coat and the careful way he moved, Lucky's eyes held the same bright intelligence that had watched over Sarah's childhood. She sank to her knees in front of him, and he approached with the dignity of someone granting an audience. "I remember you," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I remember all of it. How you knew when I was going to have nightmares before I went to sleep. How you appeared at my college dorm when I thought I was having a breakdown. How you always knew exactly what I needed." Lucky allowed Sarah to embrace him, and Eva watched her 22-year-old daughter dissolve into tears against the shoulder of the dog who had been her first and most faithful protector. David's flight was delayed, but he called from the airport with a voice Eva hadn't heard since he was small, uncertain, almost frightened. "Mom, I've been thinking about Lucky all night, and I keep remembering things." Things that didn't make sense at the time. Tell me. When I was 8 and fell off my bike, breaking my arm, Lucky started howling and running toward the accident site 20 minutes before it happened. You and Grandpa followed him, and he led you straight to where I was lying in the ditch. Eva's heart clenched. She remembered that day, remembered how Lucky's frantic behavior had seemed random until they found David injured and unable to call for help. And when I was 16 and got food poisoning at that party, the one I lied about going to, I woke up in the hospital and the nurse said a dog had been howling outside the emergency room all night. They had to call animal control to get him to leave. How did he know I was there when I never made it home? David, Mom, what is he? Because he's not just a dog. He never was just a dog. When David finally arrived that evening, his reaction was even more profound than Sarah's. He stood in the living room, staring at Lucky with an expression of wonder and recognition that made Eva's chest ache. "You're still here," he said simply. "After all these years, you're still watching over us." Lucky rose from his bed and walked to David, placing a paw on his son's knee in the same gesture he'd used when David was small and needed comforting. David's composure crumbled completely. "I used to talk to you," he said, kneeling to embrace Lucky. "When Dad and Mom would fight, when I was scared about starting high school, when I didn't know how to tell them I wanted to study computer science instead of business, I would tell you all my secrets, and you would look at me like you understood. Every word." "He did understand," Eva said softly. "That's who he is. That's who he's always been." That night, the three of them sat in the living room like they had when David and Sarah were children, Lucky moving between them with the careful attention of someone saying goodbye to each family member individually. With Eva, he rested his head in her lap, his eyes holding 50 years of shared history. With Sarah, he allowed himself to be petted and kissed, absorbing her whispered memories and promises. With David, he engaged in the kind of quiet communion they'd shared throughout David's childhood, when words weren't necessary for understanding. As the evening wore on, Eva found herself studying her children's faces as they interacted with Lucky. She could see the recognition dawning, not just of what Lucky was, but of how he had shaped them. His patient presence during their childhood fears, his uncanny ability to appear during their most vulnerable moments, his role as the steady, unchanging source of love in a family that had experienced its share of upheaval. "He's why we turned out okay, isn't he?" Sarah said suddenly. "Through the divorce, through all the times you and Dad were struggling, Lucky was the constant. He was the one who made us feel safe." Eva nodded, tears blurring her vision. "He's been our family's guardian angel, literally." Around midnight, something shifted in Lucky's behavior. He moved to the center of the room and sat facing all three of them, his posture formal and somehow final. His ancient eyes moved from face to face, as if he were memorizing each one for a journey that would take him far from here. Then he walked to Eva and placed something at her feet. A small wooden heart carved with wings that she'd never seen before. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own gentle light. "Where did this come from?" she asked, but Lucky just looked at her with eyes that said what words couldn't. A final gift, a token to remember love that transcends physical presence. David and Sarah exchanged glances, sensing that something momentous was occurring. "Is this it?" Sarah whispered. "Is this goodbye?" Lucky approached each of them one final time, allowing them to hold him, to whisper their gratitude and love into his graying fur. His tail wagged softly at each embrace, but his eyes held a peace that spoke of completion. When he returned to Eva, he rested his head against her heart and looked at her with an expression of infinite tenderness. In that look, she saw everything. The scared 6-year-old who had chosen him at the shelter, the girl he'd comforted through nightmares, the teenager he'd guided through heartbreak, the woman he'd strengthened through loss and change. She saw a lifetime of unconditional love, and she understood that it was time to let that love continue its divine journey. "Thank you," she whispered against his ear, "for everything. for choosing us, for staying with us, for teaching us how to love. We'll never forget." Lucky's eyes closed, and for a moment Ava felt the full weight of his ancient soul, centuries of love given freely, thousands of moments of choosing compassion over comfort, an existence devoted entirely to healing the broken hearts of humanity. Then he opened his eyes one last time, looking at her with such profound love that she felt her own heart expand. To hold it all. The wooden heart in her hands grew warm, and Eva understood that Lucky was transferring something to her, not just a token of remembrance, but the capacity to love others the way he had loved her family. Perfect, patient, unconditional. "Go," she whispered, though the word nearly broke her. "Go to whoever needs you next. We'll be okay. You taught us how to be okay." Lucky's tail wagged once more, a gentle acknowledgement of her permission. Then he padded slowly to his bed, circled 3 times in the ancient ritual of dogs preparing for rest, and lay down with his head pillowed on his paws. The room filled with a soft golden light that seemed to emanate from Lucky himself, and Ava felt the presence of something vast and loving, hovering just beyond the edge of perception. Their guardian angel was preparing to go home. Ava woke just before dawn to find Lucky's bed empty, but not in the way she had feared. There was no body to mourn, no physical form left behind to bury. Instead, there was only the impression of where he had lain, still warm from his presence, and a sense of peace so profound it seemed to fill every corner of the old house. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows in shafts that seemed unusually bright, creating patterns of light that danced across the empty dog bed. Ava knelt beside it, placing her hand where Lucky's head had rested, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with morning sunshine. David and Sarah found her there, drawn by the same inexplicable sense that something sacred had occurred during the night. "He's gone," Sarah said softly. But there was wonder in her voice, rather than grief. "Not gone," Eva corrected, looking at the wooden heart that now rested in the center of Lucky's bed, pulsing gently with that same golden light they'd witnessed the night before. Transformed. The 3 of them stood together in the transformed light of the living room, and Ava realized that the house itself felt different, not empty, as she'd expected, but somehow fuller than before. As if Lucky's presence had expanded, beyond physical form, to become part of the very walls, the very air they breathed. "Can you feel him?" David asked quietly. Eva nodded. Lucky was everywhere and nowhere, the way love always is after it transcends physical boundaries. She could sense his protection still surrounding them, his watchful care now woven into the fabric of their family in ways that would never fade. Sarah picked up one of Eva's childhood drawings from the table, the one showing Lucky with golden wings. "You knew," she said to her mother, "even as a child you knew he was an angel." "My heart knew," Ava replied. "It just took 50 years for my mind to catch up." They spent the morning sharing memories of Lucky, but now each story carried deeper meaning. Every moment of unexplained protection, every instance of impossible timing, every example of his uncanny understanding, all of it made perfect sense in light of what they now understood about his divine nature. Dr. Morrison, Jr. arrived around noon, saying he'd felt compelled to check on Lucky. When Ava explained what had happened, he nodded with the calm acceptance of someone who had been expecting exactly this outcome. "My father always said Lucky wouldn't die the way other dogs do," he said. "He believed Lucky would simply return to whatever realm sent him when his work was complete." The veterinarian examined Lucky's empty bed with professional curiosity, noting the warmth that still radiated from the spot and the way the light seemed to bend differently in that corner of the room. "There are no words in veterinary medicine for what I'm observing," he said finally, "but there are words in other traditions. My father would have called this a holy departure." Mrs. Muller from next door brought lunch, claiming she'd felt drawn to check on Eva and the children. As she prepared sandwiches in Henry's kitchen, she shared her own memories of Lucky's impossible presence in their community. "40 years I lived next to your grandfather," she said, "and in all that time, Lucky never aged past his prime. He looked exactly the same in 2020 as he did in 1980. I used to joke that he'd discovered the fountain of youth, but now I wonder if he simply existed outside of time the way angels do." Other neighbors arrived throughout the afternoon, drawn by the same inexplicable sense that something significant had occurred. Each person brought stories of moments when Lucky had appeared exactly when they needed him most, comforting their children during storms, guiding lost pets home, somehow knowing when families were struggling and positioning himself to offer wordless support. "He belonged to all of us," said Mr. Chen from down the road. "Your family was his home base, but his love extended to everyone in Millbrook. We all felt his protection." As the day progressed, Eva began to understand the full scope of Lucky's impact. He hadn't just been her family's guardian, he'd been a source of divine love for their entire community, touching lives in ways both obvious and subtle. The wooden heart remained in the center of Lucky's bed, its gentle pulsing, serving as a reminder that love like Lucky's doesn't disappear. It transforms, spreads, becomes part of the people who received it. That evening, as David and Sarah prepared for their respective journeys home, Eva walked through the house one final time, saying goodbye not just to Lucky, but to the version of herself who had needed a guardian. In the bathroom mirror, she studied her reflection and saw changes that had nothing to do with aging. Her eyes held a new strength, a confidence that came from understanding she carried Lucky's love within her now. She was no longer the scared 6-year-old who had needed constant protection, or the lost 58-year-old who had returned home, seeking direction. She was a woman who had been shaped by divine love and who was finally ready to share that love with others who needed it. The house on Millbrook Road would remain in the Patterson family, Eva decided, not as a museum to the past, but as a sanctuary for the future, a place where other broken hearts could come to heal, where other lost souls could learn what Lucky had spent centuries teaching, that love, real love, never leaves us. It simply changes form and continues its sacred work through the people it has touched. As the October stars appeared in the clear sky above Millbrook, Eva understood that Lucky's greatest gift wasn't the 50 years of protection he'd given her family. It was teaching her that she was capable of becoming someone else's Lucky, someone else's source of unconditional love and patient guidance. Guardian had departed, but he had left behind everything necessary for his work to continue. In the warm glow of the wooden heart, Eva felt Lucky's presence one final time, not as goodbye, but as blessing, permission to step into the role he had been preparing her for all along. The student was finally ready to become the teacher. 6 months later, the house on Millbrook Road had been transformed into something Henry and Lucky would have been proud of. A place where healing happened quietly, naturally, the way it always had under their watchful care. Eva had turned the upper floor into comfortable guest rooms for families going through difficult transitions. The main floor remained much as Henry had left it, but with additions that spoke to its new purpose, comfortable seating areas for conversations that needed space to unfold, bookshelves filled with stories about resilience and hope, and in the living room, Lucky's bed, with the wooden heart still pulsing gently with its golden light. The first family to stay had been the Hendersons from Toledo, parents navigating their teenage daughter's battle with leukemia, needing a place to rest between hospital visits in Akron. Eva had found herself sitting with them in the same living room where Lucky had comforted her through countless childhood fears, offering the same patient presence he had always provided. The second family was a young widow with twin toddlers, overwhelmed by grief and the practical challenges of single parenthood. Eva helped her organize her late husband's affairs, watched the children when she needed time alone to cry, and somehow knew exactly when to offer advice and when to simply listen. wisdom she hadn't possessed 6 months ago, but which had grown. Naturally, from watching Lucky love unconditionally for 50 years, others followed. A grandfather suddenly raising his orphaned grandchildren. A family whose farm was being foreclosed. Parents of a child born with severe disabilities. Always the broken ones, the lost ones, the ones who needed more than professional help or government assistance could provide. They needed what Lucky had spent centuries offering, the healing presence of unconditional love. Eva's children visited, regularly now, drawn by the peace that seemed to emanate from the old house. David brought his girlfriend, a software engineer who was enchanted by the stories of Lucky, and insisted on contributing her technical skills to help Eva organize resources for the families who stayed there. Sarah changed her graduate program from business to social work, claiming that understanding Lucky's divine mission had shown her what she wanted to do with her life, help people navigate their most difficult transitions with compassion and practical support. "It's like Lucky's work is continuing through all of us," Sarah said during one visit, sitting in the spot where Lucky's bed had been. "Everyone who experienced his love is passing it forward," Eva nodded, understanding now that this had always been Lucky's ultimate purpose, not just to heal individual families, but to create a network of people who had learned to love the way he loved, who would carry that divine compassion into their own corners of the world. The wooden heart had become something of a talisman for the families who stayed in the house. Children were drawn to it, often asking to hold it during difficult conversations or when they felt afraid. Adults found its gentle pulsing somehow soothing during their darkest moments. Eva had learned not to question the small miracles that seemed to occur around it, the way frightened children slept peacefully after touching it, the way grieving parents found renewed strength after sitting quietly in its presence. Lucky's love, she realized, had been concentrated into that small wooden token, available to anyone who needed it. On the anniversary of Lucky's departure, Eva sat in the living room as afternoon light streamed through the windows, creating the same ethereal patterns she'd witnessed that sacred morning 6 months ago. The house was quiet, no families staying at the moment, but it wasn't empty. It hummed with purpose, with the accumulated prayers and healing of dozens of people who had found sanctuary within its walls. A knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. Eva opened it to find a young mother holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The woman's eyes were red with recent tears, and the child pressed close to her mother's side with the particular wariness of someone who had learned too young that the world could be unsafe. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. "I'm Jennifer Walsh. My daughter Amy and we were in a car accident last month. My husband didn't make it, and we don't have anywhere to go. Someone at the church in town said you might—" "Of course," Eva said, stepping back to welcome them inside. "Come in. You're safe here." As the little girl entered the living room, her gaze immediately found Lucky's corner, where the wooden heart glowed softly in its place of honor. Amy approached it with the fearless curiosity of a child who recognizes something important, something meant for her. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the heart. "That belonged to a very special dog who used to live here," Eva explained. "His name was Lucky, and his job was taking care of people who needed love and protection." Amy tilted her head, studying the gently pulsing light. "Is he gone now?" Eva knelt beside the child, seeing in her young face the same mixture of fear and resilience she had once possessed, the same need for something larger than herself to believe in. "His body is gone," Eva said gently, "but his love is still here. In fact, I think he knew you were coming, and he wanted you to know that you're going to be okay." As if in response to her words, the wooden heart pulsed brighter for a moment, casting golden shadows on the walls that seemed to dance with welcome. Amy's eyes widened with wonder rather than fear. "He's still taking care of people?" "In a way, yes. Through all of us who learned how to love by watching him." Eva took Amy's small hand in hers, feeling the familiar surge of protective affection that Lucky had taught her to recognize and trust. "Would you like to stay here for a while, until you and your mom figure out what comes next?" Amy nodded. Then surprised Eva by stepping closer and hugging her the way children do when they recognize a safe person, completely, trustingly, without reservation. Holding this broken child in the same room where Lucky had held her broken heart 52 years ago, Eva felt the perfect completion of a circle that had begun in an animal shelter when a scared little girl chose the dog nobody else wanted. She had become what Lucky had always been preparing her to be, a guardian for those who needed one most, a source of unconditional love for families navigating their darkest hours. Outside, the October afternoon light cast the same golden glow it had on the day she'd first brought Lucky home, and Eva understood that some stories never really end. They simply transform and continue through the people they've touched, creating an endless chain of divine love passing from one wounded heart to the next, healing spreading like ripples in a quiet pond forever and ever. In the corner of the room, Lucky's wooden heart pulsed with gentle approval, and Eva could almost hear his voice in the autumn wind, saying what he'd always said without words: "Love them the way I loved you." That's how miracles continue. And in the arms of a grieving child who had already begun to heal, Eva smiled and began the sacred work of passing on the greatest gift she had ever received, the knowledge that sometimes broken things choose each other, and when they do, beautiful miracles unfold.